webinar on borderless Europe. When do we go back to normal? It's an extremely timely and relevant conversation as we enter a new phase of loosening the confinement measures and restart our economy in light of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. So my name is Alex Martin. I'm the head of the GLOBSEC Brussels office, and I will be the moderator of today's conversation. And I'm joined today by a fantastic lineup of speakers. Alena Kudzko, GLOBSEC Policy Institute Director, Lukas Mandl, Member of European Parliament, EPP family, Michal Šimečka, Member of European Parliament, Renew Europe, Tom Snells, Deputy Head of Cabinet, Commissioner Ylva Johansson for Home Affairs, and Katarina Sorensen, Deputy Director of think tank Europa. Before we kick off, I wanted to share a few housekeeping notes with the audience. We are on record. In addition to Zoom, we are live on Facebook, and we will be monitoring the feed there also to pick up questions for the panelists. We also have live tweeting under the hashtag GLOBSECGoesDigital. The project is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and forms part of our project called DIFF, European Governance Potential for Differentiated Cooperation. We'll start this conversation with a couple of remarks by Alena to present her findings in a recently launched report on Schengen. And then we'll continue with the first round of comments from all panelists. And we are asking everyone to feed us with questions via the Q&A platform. So Alena, floor is yours to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you everybody for joining. I wanted to start with setting up the scene a little bit and putting the things in a broader perspective. Coronavirus has highlighted definitely a lot of things in life that people have taken for granted, and free movement is surely one of them. Now with the borders closed, the realization sinks in how much it has given us. And the momentum this appreciation generates should in theory facilitate as quick a reopening as possible. What we're trying to look at with the project, and actually you can download a series of papers from our website, we're looking at the resilience of the Schengen zone in the post-crisis world, or rather in a world that is marked by a permanent crisis or by a series of crises. We have now a broader agreement that borders were necessary to control the spread of the virus and that they are of temporary nature. Our concern is whether the nature of the border controls is indeed temporary and whether it is possible to ever return to Schengen as before. What are the alternative scenarios and how to get to, or what should we be doing now to get to the best possible scenario, which is the full Schengen? Why this is not as easy as it may sound. The crisis has highlighted how important national borders are in the mind of people. Closure of borders was not always necessarily the most efficient response in all cases, but in minds of people, national borders protect. It wasn't the EU external border that everybody was waiting for to protect them, it was the national border that gave the feeling and the reality of control. But also what's important here is that the free movement zone in Europe already had pre-existing conditions. Coronavirus crisis exacerbates these conditions, and that's an additional and rather complicated layer. First concern is, of course, migration. There is nothing new here. We all know the troubles we had with the flow of migrants in Europe, and then the secondary movements within Europe, and what effect it had. Second is, of course, terrorism, which has not disappeared either. And actually, even now in the coronavirus situation, France is citing the abuse of vulnerabilities created by coronavirus crisis by terrorists as an official explanation why they're keeping border checks. Another concern is, of course, nationalism. As I described, the introduction of national borders is a reflex that many countries use, whether consciously or unconsciously. And of course, we're not protected against other waves of the coronavirus crisis or of the return of the crisis or the coming of another pandemic in the form of another crisis. We simply cannot ignore these non-corona factors like migration and terrorism because they have not disappeared and have not solved themselves. What it means for the future of Schengen zone. There are definitely several scenarios. One of them is the total collapse of the Schengen zone, which is rather unlikely exactly because that now probably more than ever people understand the value of the Schengen zone and the free movement. The second scenario, and we're getting there in the more in the higher likelihood of what can be happening, The second scenario is that Schengen zone is going to be broken up into smaller Schengens, where the countries cluster with like-minded ones. Already before this crisis, we had discussions that, for example, even Emmanuel Macron was making statements that we need to reconsider who is the member of Schengen if, let's say, some countries do not want to participate in the solidarity mechanisms and relocation of the migrants within the Schengen zone. And this tendency might continue in the future. Another scenario is just to keep the status quo and to keep the things as they are. Situation that we have now where countries pretty much introduce border checks without much clarity in justifications or ignoring the Schengen code, for example, on how long the checks can last. And that was what happened for example, after the 2015 migration crisis, where 6 countries kept the border controls for much longer probably than the Schengen code originally created the possibility for. And given the current situation and potential health threats, the status quo and pre-corona that was there with us before the coronavirus crisis will become even more unsustainable. And of course, the ideal version is the full and fully functioning Schengen zone. I will stop here now, but I hope that in this discussion, we will also be able to elaborate on ideas how to resolve the current border situation, but also how to create the framework for a more resilient Schengen zone in the future.
Thank you, Alena, for framing this conversation, and I will give each of the panelists a chance to respond to what you said. And we are looking at the issues that you mentioned that also existed before coronavirus: migration, terrorism, nationalism, and other type of crisis, and then the 4 scenarios that you put forward. So, Lucas, I'm getting to you because you are from the other side of the border. You are representing Austria in the European Parliament, and the erection of border infrastructure overnight between Austria and Slovakia came as a stark reminder of the past. And this is one of the most transited borders, at least in Central and Eastern Europe. And with the new measures in place, people were literally cut off. So in your view, how are the unilateral measures taken by the member states to restrict travel across Europe reflected in the long-term resilience of Schengen, and to what extent these measures will erode the sentiment or the collective sentiment of Schengen as a policy of cooperation?
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invite, and good morning to everybody. Thanks to GLOBSEC for organizing today's meeting, and thanks to everybody for the exchange. I also look forward to the discussion then and to the questions. Actually, my hometown, Gerasdorf, is pretty close to the Slovakian border. And I'm pretty aware of what you have mentioned already. And my home region, Lower Austria, is actually pretty much affected by the lack of Slovakian workers, especially in the field of the care for the elderly and in the field of agriculture. And that's why I really feel what it means to have Schengen and to have open borders and to have especially open borders for goods and services. And that's the first thing I want to state, while agreeing with a lot of things Alena has said today, which I want to go deeper into afterwards, like people expected and maybe still expect more security from the national borders than from the EU borders. That's something we have to deal with, and we see here problems we have to solve from a political and parliamentary point of view. We need Schengen, and it's clear to me, and it has been clear from the very beginning of this crisis, that we have to close the borders for non-essential travel, for regular touristic private travel, to protect each other. That's nothing about history or about European integration or anything alike. It's to protect each other. Like even the single household has to more or less close its borders in times of the pandemic to protect each other. And at the same time, and I'm lucky that after a few obstacles in the beginning, this worked out well. At the same time, we need these open borders for goods and services, in my view, because that's what makes Europe strong. Open borders for goods and services, the common market. That's also something that will help that Europe will maybe be better off after the pandemic than the United States and other parts of the world. So it's one of the strengths of Europe, but on the long run, and this is also a field where I agree with Alena. On the long run, we need the protection of the EU borders, much better than in the past. We need it today, we need it on an everyday basis, but we will need it on the long run to remain with open borders within the European Union and to remain with Schengen. And that's where we have to invest. Nobody yet knows what kind of new migration movements will be caused by the pandemic, but there will remain some kind of migration movements in the future. We have to do the best that we can in order to make sure that people don't get uprooted in the first place, so that they can dwell where they live. And most of the people want to dwell where they live. They don't want to get uprooted. And as we all know, because of smugglers and of other criminals, they sometimes follow false promises. So these are the migration movements we have to avoid. And even if they anyway happen in this or that case, we have to protect our borders. That's the most important, to keep Schengen alive after the pandemic. And of course, also a post-Dublin agreement will be necessary. For example, the opportunity to relocate migrants also in safe third countries. And it's not theoretical from my side. I mean, especially the Western Balkan countries, which have already helped us a lot in many cases regarding migration and migration movements. But that's, I would say that's not mandatory. Schengen has to remain in place, whether there will be quickly a post-Dublin agreement or not. But these seem to me the most important factors, the external borders and the post-Dublin agreement, to keep Schengen alive after the pandemic. And maybe I conclude again with really my opinion, which I want to state here. It's fine that we close borders, and we closed them in the beginning of the pandemic for non-essential travel, because it means to protect each other, and it's in no way connected with a lack of European solidarity. It's the opposite, actually. It means European solidarity to protect each other and to close borders for that, but to remain with open borders for goods and services, in my view.
Thank you very much, Luca. So an optimistic way of closing the borders as a show of solidarity for the other countries and to protect each other. You did raise the point on that security is seen more coming from the national borders than Europeans, and that's something that probably Tom will also get on. But meanwhile, Michal, your view from the Slovak side as a representative in European Parliament, do you agree with what Luca said? Your initial remarks, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone, and thanks again to GLOBSEC and the team for putting this together and for the invitation. Of course, I agree very much with Lucas in the sense that that at some point the border closures, such as is in itself a social distancing measure, is in itself a measure to slow down the traffic and exchange of people, which at one point became a danger to our health. So in that sense, it was necessary. I think the problem rather with the closure of borders at the outset of the crisis was not the fact that it was done, but the fact that it was not particularly well coordinated between and among the member states, at least in the early days. But let me go back to to the situation and to the sense that we have in Central Europe, or maybe in Slovakia, with the situation, because Alena alluded to it, that now that borders are closed, we are starting to appreciate the value of open Europe. And I don't know to what extent you've caught this news, but there was news report that a couple of days ago at the Polish-Czech border, the Polish armed forces guarding the border actually fired warning shots at a man who was, I think he was a German citizen, attempting to cross the border from the Czech Republic to Poland by foot. And I mean, in itself, nothing happened, and it was probably everything was all right. But just the sight of shots being fired at the border in Central Europe, in this part of the world, stirs some very bad memories and old demons. So I think this is also the way that this is felt. And in my country, or in Bratislava specifically, I mean, given the exchange that is happening, or that used to be happening between, or at the Austrian-Slovak border, given the thousands and thousands of people who either commute to Austria every day, or they live in Austria and work in Bratislava. I mean, this is very much a personal issue as well. I mean, my sister is caught in Vienna and cannot return home even to see our parents, because she wouldn't be allowed to get back because she doesn't have permanent residency. And these are lots and lots of stories like this. So I think you're right, Alena, that people are starting to appreciate what it meant, that they could, what Schengen meant for them, and for their sense of freedom. But then it's not going to be easy, and that's partly going back to the argument I made before, that the problem was that that we've entered this crisis in an uncoordinated fashion, including the border shutdowns, and it's still rather easy to close borders, and it's incredibly difficult to sort of glue Schengen back together and to start restoring status quo ex ante in a coordinated fashion. I mean, it hasn't been done, as Alena says, and as the paper rightly puts it, it hasn't been done even since the migration crisis. There still wasn't a fully functioning border, and that was 4 or 5 years after the crisis. So I think the scenario that we're likely to see, because of the difficulty of going back to full Schengen, I think will be very patchy, and will be sort of shifting coalitions of countries which will open borders among themselves. This will be fluid depending on the health situation, as the virus might be coming back and there might be new outbreaks. Of course, I mean, it's, the Commission, this is sort of one of the fundamental problems, that the Commission has some authority and some power to intervene, but actually not in reality, when in a crisis situation, it doesn't really have the authority and the legitimacy to enforce the Schengen Code. And I think this is a perennial problem of Schengen going forward. But I see the scenario of sort of a patchy and fragmented Schengen going forward, at least in the next couple of months or years even.
Thank you, Michal. And this is the perfect segue actually to Tom, to tell us more from the Commission perspective. How did we learn the lesson of the initial uncoordinated actions, and what is the Commission doing now to make sure that we are not fragmenting Schengen, and all countries are actually working together to lift the restrictions and to ensure that also our single market is functioning and our the freedom of movement is restored. So Tom, to you now.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, and thanks so much for organizing this. Very important debate, very interesting views. Also, congratulations on the paper, which is a really excellent, thought-provoking, well-researched paper. So I agree with a lot of things that are in the paper, and I agree with most what has been already said by my esteemed other panelists. I think there's a lot of talk about is this the end of Schengen, and I would say not at all. I think the situation has shown how indispensable Schengen has become gradually, because this has been a very gradual step-by-step process over the years. And I think the situation, especially for people that either professionally or personally have links with people on the other side of the border, or companies, or are helping or working in the healthcare sector, for example, with this border closure, this something that was acquired, and which is one of the key cornerstones of the European project, has become very obvious, in how indispensable this has become for our day-to-day life. And indeed, there are citizens protesting on border regions today. So I totally agree that the measures that have been taken were necessary to protect the health and the lives of the Europeans. And now the question is, of course, how we kind of go out of this situation in a coordinated way, because the virus came took us a little bit by surprise, but I think very rapidly both member states and the Commission and the European institutions reacted to this, and now we are, we have a roadmap to go back, in a coordinated step-by-step way. So let me just make maybe 3 points. First, the state of play today. So today we have recommended, and virtually all of the Schengen states, member states, and Schengen associated countries have implemented restrictions at the external border for non-essential travel. We have recommended this would stay in place until 15th of May, and we will come back to that with a recommendation how to go forward. On the internal border side, I think there are 17 member states to date that have notified checks, because it's not border closures, of course, it is checks and at the borders, and we are in constant contact with member states to resolve issues that arise, that inevitably have arisen because of the kind of the uncoordinated and very quick way that these measures have been put in place. The Commission has adopted a number of guidelines to ensure that essential services and goods and cross-border workers should remain be able to cross borders within 15 minutes. We have proposed these green lanes, which is working relatively well in practice. Commissioner Johansson is in constant contact with our counterparts in the member states to resolve issues. We have video conference meetings of a member of ministers at least once a week. So we have done this even twice a week. So I think we have had more meetings with the ministers of the interior in a span of a couple of weeks than we had over the course of last year, for example. Commissioner Johansson will also come to the European Parliament next week to have a discussion with the Libe committee on where we are. So there's a lot of work going on. Colleagues are working day and night to resolve issues and to map the issues and to reach out. So second point is where do we go from here? Together with the President of the European Council, we have now a joint European roadmap towards lifting of the COVID containment measures. There are essentially, the message there is that this will not be like a switch, that we flick and the situation goes back to normal. I'm not sure we ever go back to the pre-corona times. We go back to a new normal, but I think there are 3 essential criteria that will trigger the gradual releasing of restrictions and measures. One, of course, is the spread of the disease. Second is the capacity of the health systems, of the hospitals, the intensive care units. And the third, and that's an important element, of course, is how to monitor these developments. And this is where we have discussions on applications, tracking applications and so on. The idea is indeed, if you cannot leave your house, I think, we're not going to talk about the external borders. We have to kind of gradually release the measures that restrict, the freedom of movement. So the external border will be kind of last in line, and on the internal border, once the situation permits, I think we are working towards kind of a strategy that will, enable the releasing of measures, in areas where the health situation kind of converges in regions where the social distancing measures actually are applied and are respected, and there's a sense of responsibility. And we work together with the European Center for Disease Control to help us map those areas, and that we can kind of, gradually, phase by phase, release those measures based on, of course, first and foremost, the health situation. So it will be a step-by-step. We have not only land borders, of course, we also have air borders and sea borders, and that's part of the picture. Part of the thinking is, of course, what is the purpose of travel? We've already said that, essential cross-border workers, seasonal workers, frontier workers should be able to continue now, and we will monitor that and follow up also with the respective national administrations. The circulation of essential goods and services, there are guidelines on that one, and we follow up. what is also the social purpose. We get a lot of contacts of people who are stuck, who have their partner, or family on the other side of the border, who want to go and see them or visit relatives. We have the summer is coming. So there's a lot of work going on how we can support the tourism sector in these times. Is difficult matter, but I think it's really important, especially also for the small businesses in Europe that are involved in that. So what is the purpose? What is the social purpose of travel, and to identify categories where you can gradually kind of release, the restrictions. Just the last point on the future scenarios. I think, I would advocate really a fifth scenario to the four that would have been set out, and it really builds on the idea that Schengen was not perfectly functioning before the COVID-19 crisis. Schengen has been very much a very step by step, a very slow process. I think it took 10 years between the signing of the agreement, the Schengen agreement in 1985 already, and it took 10 years before actually the checks on the borders were actually released. Gradually, also the size of the Schengen area has increased. So I would put forward a fifth scenario that it would go, something like completing the Schengen area, not back to Schengen, but a forward-looking completing Schengen, which both on substance, requires a number of measures that are already being mentioned. One area is migration and asylum, which is really necessary that we go to.
I will stop on that one because I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
So we will go into a second round, but I let you finish your thought on completing Schengen, and then I want to move to Katarina. So your last minute, please.
Okay. So indeed, I was just about to finish. What is required to move forward with Schengen, of course, is an agreement with the member states, with the parliament, on a new pact for migration and asylum, which is very close to being finalized. There are a lot of work has gone into that. On the other side is the internal security, where Commissioner Johansson also will come forward with a number of ideas how to reinforce cooperation, which is also necessary to ensure trust between member states and the absence of internal border checks. And then, of course, the strengthening of the external borders, where we have Frontex and so on. So that is intricately interlinked. And we require further progress on all of those areas in order to kind of move forward with Schengen. And then last but not least, we've already recommended the expansion of the Schengen area, but with Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia. So that is also important moving forward. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. Very comprehensive. A new scenario in place. Katarina, how are all these things, measures taken from Brussels, measures taken across Europe, reflected in the Nordic countries, in particular Denmark? Is a scenario of smaller Schengens maybe less favorable for the Danish public? I throw the ball back to you to reflect on what the previous speakers have said. But let's try to keep all our remarks within 3 minutes, so we take some of the questions, as we have just half an hour left.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to GLOBSEC for having me and for highlighting this discussion, which I think as the virus fades, the border discussion will spread even more, especially now that the tourist season starts, as Tom also pointed out. I think it would be very difficult to give a Nordic perspective on this, because my country, Denmark, and our closest neighbor, Sweden, are probably very different on this question. I think, as the report highlights, that there might be a risk that borders are among one of the last barriers from this lockdown to be lifted, and I think that could definitely be the case here in Denmark, where some parties in Parliament openly want the border controls to be permanent, even. I think, listening to the discussion, I just wanted maybe to raise 3 points that were also very much on my mind. The first is this question that we really need to ask ourselves: what are the controls actually about? Because yes, as the previous speakers also said, they are to keep us safe. But I think there are 2 signs that this is not the full story to this. The first is that when the Danish prime minister went out and made this point as one of the first prime ministers to close the borders. And I think borders also are very contagious. This border closing had a very contagious effect across Europe. But when the Danish prime minister on the 11th of March went out to make this point, that we need the border controls to keep us safer, she was actually, in a very rare occurrence, corrected by the head of the Danish health authority, who went out to say, this is not our health advice. We do not see the health argument for making this move. It's a political move, and the prime minister accepted this. So I think that's one point in a society where I think normally we have a fair share of trust in experts. I think that's a fair point. That's one point to keep in mind. And the second one is that there was also some sign of an amplifier effect. Countries which had a very vocal opinion on migration were among the first to close, and there are definitely countries which have not introduced border controls as a response to the coronavirus. That goes for Sweden, who's generally taking a looser approach, but also for a country like the Netherlands, as far as I'm aware. So I think we need to also really truly grasp that borders make us feel safer, with an emphasis on the feel. And that goes for borders, that goes for control in this world that we have today. So we make our own surveys here at the think tank Europa, and half the Danes actually believe that border control, which we've had in Denmark since 2016 in response to the migration crisis, half of the Danes believe that these controls are effective in bringing down illegal migration and crime rates. I haven't seen one statistic proving this. So I think, well, first of all, that's one call for the Commission to perhaps make more statistics available on the effect of border controls. But I also think we just need to keep this perspective in mind, that we saw from Brexit as well, control is such a powerful word today. When making efforts to lift border controls, that definitely needs to be understood. The second point, briefly, is that, and I think I very much pick up on what Tom said just before he was stopped, but maybe can elaborate in the second round, is that we maybe don't talk so much about going back to Schengen, but about enhancing Schengen. Because I think control in some ways is here to stay. I think people need to feel reassured that there are controls in place, and saying back to Schengen will somehow remind of this completely open ideal. Very nice for sure in many views, but that somehow we will make and that ties into the smart border debate, that we will somehow together in Europe make sure that we can do this in a controlled and safe way. That might lead to some new steps of maybe controls where they make more sense. Also the anti-terrorist point that you said France is highlighting now. That could be some, maybe not the land border, but other crossings and so on. But the smart Schengen, I think, is better than back to Schengen. And finally, I think once, of course, all corona-related controls have been dealt with, if the virus situation allows, I think the discussion is also what is essential for Schengen and what is destroying Schengen. I mean, it's very, I think, to be thankful that Schengen is so resilient and has proven so resilient. I think there's some much good to be said about having some vague rules and ambiguous rules in the Schengen code. Schengen has not broken up. It may be on a break, but it's not broken up. And still, but related to that, the pre-corona situation, I think from an purely economic perspective, it's fair to say that was not a disruption to the internal market. I know it was probably mainly symbolic and an annoyance to many, but also there were no major signs of queues or disrupted supply chains. So I think keeping this discussion about what is essential for Schengen to keep it going and what is actually ruining Schengen also needs to be kept in mind.
Thank you so much, Katarina. I think that it's very interesting to see various perspectives, depending also on the geographical location and the institutions that we work on. We started getting some questions, so in my second round, I'll try to incorporate those also in the next round. I'm going back to Michal and Lucas because I think it's important to also look at how EP is playground also to navigate national priorities when it comes to migration, not just related to the current context, but also longer term. So I would like to hear from your view what's going on in Parliament when it comes to national migration priorities. And we had a question from the audience, from Patricia Maradi, on do you envisage a scenario where we would be able to fully respond to such crisis with a full Schengen without borders control in place? So maybe we start again with you, Lucas, and then Michal, the same question will apply to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the contributions. I have listened closely to them and I agree with a lot and I have learned a lot actually. I just want to underline really my view that it actually saved lives that we closed borders for non-essential travel in Europe. That's my view. I'm not a medical expert, but I see the results and the numbers. The numbers show that not closing only the single households and many factories and nearly all bars and cafes and restaurants in Europe, but also closing the borders where we have them, and that's actually the case with the member states, meant that less outbreak was the result. But of course, we need, and I agree with the fact that we not only need back to Schengen, but a smart Schengen. I like this idea. I like this expression actually. When it comes to interests or positions of member states and the ones of the European Union, I would really say there is only one relevant interest. That's the one of the citizens of Europe. And of course of each and every human being in the world when it comes to migration, but we have the obligation to do our political and parliamentary work on the European level. And that means we have not only to protect our borders against especially illegal migration, but we also have to find also smart ways to deal with asylum and migration and integration within Europe. And we see that not each and every member state has the same will to relocate migrants. And not each and every migrant has the will to go in whatever country, but they have very clear impressions on what country they want to go to. And that's why we need solidarity in Europe in dealing with migrants, but some kind of flexibility. And I would call it an alternative solidarity. That means you can contribute by taking refugees, as Austria has taken very large number of refugees since the migration crisis. It's on the third place. Austria is on the third place Europe-wide after Sweden and I guess Malta. But there should be alternative opportunities to contribute to solidarity, like with money, with helping at the external borders for border security, like education, like development aid, like fighting the causes of people getting uprooted in other parts of the world. So that's the view I have on a future migration and asylum system in Europe, which we have to negotiate on. And as already mentioned, the post-Dublin agreement needs the opportunity to relocate migrants in safe third countries. And I've already mentioned the Western Balkans. And one question I read already was, when will the EU be able to solve such a crisis with fully operational Schengen? Will it ever be there? Frankly, my deep understanding is that a crisis like this needs as one of the mandatory measures to close borders. And that's also one opportunity within the Schengen system to close borders for a while, temporary. Most important word in this first part, I would say today, is from Alena, with temporary. It's temporary, but we needed it, and such kind of crisis, hopefully the only pandemic in this century, also needs these closed borders. So I guess that's my view on this question.
We also hope that it's the last pandemic of this century, but we have another 80 years to go, so we never know where we will get. Michal, to you. Especially coming from a region that is not the most let's call it supportive when it comes to the relocation of migrants and to migration in general. Let's keep it short to about two minutes intervention so we can take even more questions. We have 20 minutes left.
Thanks. I just very quickly to address the second question that you have, whether this crisis could have been addressed in Europe as a whole, actually while retaining Schengen operational. I tend to agree with Lucas that it would be nearly impossible, and that introducing border checks sort of saved lives and made sense. But especially because the crisis responses of member states were uncoordinated and often differed from country to country. So at any given point in time, I mean, you had open cafes in say the Netherlands and open bars, but they were already closed in neighboring Belgium. In that particular instance, it obviously made sense to introduce border checks because because then otherwise it would hamper the crisis measures and their effectiveness, those introduced in Belgium, because obviously people would go from Belgium to have a beer in the Netherlands. So I think this is part of the problem, that we could have retained some of the Schengen openness even while dealing with the crisis, but that would have required maximum coordination in restriction and crisis measures, which obviously that was not the case. And on migration, you're right that Slovakia is one of the countries that's been, the most perhaps or the least flexible and the least cooperative in the past 7 years, or how long I've been discussing this. Especially when it comes to solidarity and the sort of the thorny issues, I don't expect that much change in this position of the government in Slovakia despite elections. And I actually, and obviously, I mean, we'll be all looking forward to the publication of the migration pact by the Commission. My suspicion is that there are actually no new ideas in here. I mean, all of those ideas that will be probably in the pact and in some way or another were already discussed. I mean, from reinforcing external borders to obviously an effective returns policy to solidarity, which is more flexible. All these things are somewhere in the debate already. The question is whether we find a compromise now that they've been so elusive for the past couple of years, and what will the balance and the elements of that compromise be. My sense is that it's going to become more difficult because of the coronavirus, because nationalist, isolationist tendencies and extremist currents will be strengthened by this. Yes, you would see people calling for borders to be permanent, calling for Fortress Europe. I think the corona experience and the trauma of the lockdowns and everything and fear will strengthen those voices. And there will be people who will be saying that the whole spread of the corona epidemic is due to Schengen, which of course cannot be more wrong. Just look at the United Kingdom. But I think this is going to be an argument that's going to be used in debate, and it will also poison the debate on reforming Dublin and migration pact and all that. That's kind of my worry.
For sure, migration and Schengen are instrumentalized and will continue to be instrumentalized for various political gains, in particular by some political actors. Tom, the question for you is related to the new EU pact for migration and asylum, when to expect. But before getting to you, I want to ask Alena and Katerina about the smart Schengen. And in your view, based on the research and the reports that you produced, what would be those measures now that we are preparing to lift the restrictions that will contribute to minimizing the risk of further spread of the crisis continuing, and will allow for a normalization to a new Schengen, let's put it that way. So what would be those measures that you would recommend as experts, both to the Commission and the national governments? Alena, you want to go first?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Alex, and everybody. I agree absolutely with the defining where we're going to end up post-crisis as a smart Schengen, because indeed, as in many other areas, there is no point in going back to an inferior version that we had before, and we can use it as an opportunity to create a better version or an upgrade. The question is, and that goes along with what Michal was just saying, whether we're in the current environment able to find political compromises and the political will to create this upgraded version. From the technical point of view, what kind of measures can be there? Definitely Tom started talking about it, and Michal alluded to the question that in a way, all these measures and suggestions were made multiple times. Like, for example, if we are talking about enhanced cooperation on security matters, we do know that we need to build trust and find better ways to coordinate the intelligence services and the information sharing within the European Union, be it through creating shared databases or better passing giving access to the national information to authorities in other countries. So the question, these technical measures that are very well outlined and are there. The question now is how to move forward on implementing them in practice. And I also agree with everybody who made the comment before that it's very likely that finding these compromises and implementing these measures will take many years to come. From my perspective, it's actually these technical measures that are most valuable in the current situation because they do not attract so much public attention and political discussions. It's much easier to talk and find a solution on the technical measure, let's say how to share databases between the various actors, because the general public doesn't pay that much attention and it's not politicized. Then looking for a big symbolic compromises on the migration that's attract a lot of attention and can be abused for domestic political purposes. Also wanted to make one more comment, and that's connected to the discussion about whether we go for economic efficiency and functioning of the single markets. And there were highlighted many times already in the discussion that it's very important that the single market from the point of view of the free movement of goods was not, we did everything we could to facilitate the smooth functioning of this part. And then moving forward, there will be a discussion what is essential for the Schengen zone and what's not essential. But I would be very careful in defining what's not essential and trying to eliminate the symbolic aspect from the discussion. Because Michal was talking about how important it is for Central Europe symbolically to keep the open borders. And the symbolic element cannot always be just taken out of the discussion. And also, there are also practical linkages between symbolic and economic aspects. For example, we already had the discussion, let's say in many Western countries, and that was definitely a discussion even in the UK before Brexit, whether the workers from Central Europe or Southern Europe should be allowed in. And that was a very politicized and emotional and symbolic debate. What we're seeing now, especially let's say in France and Germany, is there's suddenly a discussion who is going to be harvesting asparagus in all these countries because all the workers are not coming. And suddenly France and Germany would love the posted workers because in the end, everybody who was criticizing the policy, nobody wants to take the places of these workers. So I would advocate also for not entirely, yes, in going forward with trying to implement the small technical measures that would lead to a big upgrade in the future, but also not forgetting the symbolic elements that are very important for the public discourse.
Thanks a lot, Alena. I think this small wins approach could save the day in the current very intense context. And indeed, symbolics and economic measures do go hand in hand, and they are diverse or they are distinct from region to region. And that's something that I'm not really entirely sure that in Brussels this message is well captured. Katerina, what smart measures would you recommend moving forward to create that new or upgraded Schengen? You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Well, I think in terms of how Schengen can respond with this, both the virus threat, the invisible threat, and the visible not threat, but the visible occurrence of migration and free movement. Well, I think with the virus, I think it has been social distancing that really has worked. It doesn't matter if you are from another country, if you keep 2 meters away from each other, the risk of spreading the virus will become less. And I think what some countries have also done is to introduce internal borders, regions, where it made sense. And I think that's maybe a point to take away in the future of Schengen discussions, because in my view, the key question should be where does accepting that control in some way has come to stay, maybe more than we've had in the past, where does this control make more sense? Is it necessarily at a land border, or could it be at key infrastructure points? If it's health tests and fever control, is it at airports? Is it supermarkets, big shopping centers? Where does it make sense to have control, provided that control is here to stay, and to have a joint EU discussion on that? And on the smart borders issue, I mean, some of these initiatives that are mainly today discussed on the external Schengen border could maybe with EU help be discussed at internal borders or at key infrastructure points. That's, you know, number plate scanners, a lot of initiatives to quickly and smoothly ensure control, but without having to get people necessarily out of their cars. But those are extremely expensive measures. And perhaps now that we are talking about using EU funds to both to jointly exit from the crisis, maybe that could be focused on jointly helping member states develop more smart border, maybe not border, but smart infrastructure in terms of making sure Schengen can work.
Thank you, Katarina. Tom, the question for you: when should we expect the new EU Migration and Asylum Pact? And to connect with that, maybe you could also give us a glimpse of light on how the EU is maintaining a sufficient level of support for external border states receiving migrants. So the external borders of the EU in the current context where the burden sharing has been quite a contentious issue for some time.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. I'll be, I know I talked a bit too much in the beginning, so I'll be very, very brief now. I agree very much with what Katarina said on borders, actually. I think we are dealing with a virus that does not know borders, but it does know social distancing. So I think, you know, that should be the start of the reflection in terms of, you know, relaxing measures. On what Schengen, there are two questions I saw there. There's a fully functioning Schengen. Is this necessary to deal with a crisis like these? Absolutely. I think solidarity, cross-border solidarity, is absolutely indispensable, and we have seen many good examples of, for example, Romanian healthcare workers going to help in hospitals. In Italy, for example, there are numerous examples of where member states have helped each other, both in terms of personnel, but also in equipment. There are also numerous examples on the migration and asylum side, even in these times of Corona crisis, where there are restrictions at borders and non-essential movement is limited. You know, there are a few member states, notably Luxembourg and Germany, that have welcomed unaccompanied minors that were stuck on Greek islands. And so I think that is very encouraging. There are a number of member states that are very soon will follow suit. There's Switzerland, there's Portugal, there's Slovenia, and there are, I think, generally 10 more member states that agreed in principle to receive 1,600 children who are alone and teenagers who are alone in Greece, even in these times of crisis and of, you know, restrictions. This is possible. So the word on the pact, will it be more difficult now? I think this was, you know, it took a number of years to discussions that then didn't materialize under the previous commission. Now we have a new commission. We have a strong support of the commission president to move forward with a new pact. I think the signs are actually quite favorable. I think on the side of the member states, the ministers seem to be also eagerly anticipating to start discussing and negotiating a new pact to get out of this blocked situation. Also on the parliament side, I think we have seen many encouraging signals. So I think we're very close. Commissioner Johansson has met all member states bilaterally in person in the capitals in the beginning of the mandate, and followed up you know, almost every day. So I think the question on when this pact will come. I think, you know, now with the Corona measures, I think we are working very much on a recovery package that touches upon the economic side, also on the MFF side. And so as soon as we have dealt with the most pressing issues, I think we will be ready to come forward. We don't have a date yet, but I think it is important to move on quickly, as the Commissioner also said after the last Council meeting. So I'm relatively optimistic, actually, that we can get out of this. And then just one last point, I think the paper also mentions the role that migrants play in these Corona times in different sectors, in essential sectors, in the healthcare sector. You mentioned also the work in the agricultural sector. We need both intra and extra EU migrants to help. They play a significant role, and that only works, of course, when we have, you know, an open Schengen system and a good functioning migration system. And that is one of the key elements of a new pact, which will be comprehensive and will contain new elements. So stay tuned for that.
I'm happy to hear that optimism. We are approaching the end of it. I will give each one of you 1 minute for wrap-up remarks, but I do want to take stock of a few important conclusions that I feel obliged as moderator to share. So Schengen is here to stay, but we need a smart Schengen, an upgraded version that will fit the new needs and long-term resilience objectives. Closing the borders was a sign of solidarity, not of lack of solidarity, and it was needed to control the disease. And then the EU Migration Pact is somewhere on the pipeline with an optimistic view that might come sooner rather than later. However, with the current economic rescue packages and discussions, we'll have to see how that work will come together and might also be politicized by various parts of Europe. With that in mind, I will start with again with Lucas and Michal for your final 1 minute remarks. And if you could also maybe touch upon MFF negotiations and how if borders play a role into these negotiations. Lucas?
Thank you. I tried to be brief since I also have to leave for a different appointment at 11. I'm happy that we remain within the time schedule. I just want to share my view that all reasonable groups in European Parliament, which is the vast majority, and all reasonable officials of governments of the European Union member states are on the same line when it comes to the question of solidarity. What we talk about is not if we need solidarity, but how we do it. And that's true for within Europe, solidarity within the European Union, as well as for solidarity with migrants and people who get uprooted and so on. So let's keep in touch and let's negotiate, even post-Dublin Agreement and everything else that had been mentioned today. But let's always remember that we all want solidarity and want to act within the framework of the European values.
Thank you, Lucas. Michal?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm glad that the debate has sort of taken an optimistic turn, and it's really glad to hear. And I'm really looking forward to the Commission's work on restoring the Schengen free zone, and then proposing migration and asylum pact that could be accepted by all member states, and of course then presenting a smart Schengen or improvements to the Schengen area, also taking stock of our response to the epidemic. And it all sounds great, and I would be the one also in the European Parliament and my political group that would support the Commission in this and try to work with the EPP and with other groups. I just have a sort of a lingering kind of a worry or anxiety that politics will interfere, national politics specifically in some member states, and given also the economic crisis and the trauma that we've just all been through with lockdowns, I can't see this not impacting on these debates, frankly. And then there's one final thing which I wanted to mention, which has been mentioned in passing, but that's all of these measures and all of these reforms, be it to the Schengen itself or to the migration and asylum, require a huge amount of trust between member states, and that trust is not just about how you handle things on the other side of the border, how well you check travelers or migrants or whoever. It's also something more fundamental, and it has to do also with rule of law, with democracy, with all of these issues that are at the heart of the EU. And this, I think, is sort of a more underlying problem, is that as we see some governments sort of departing from what we would consider the European constitutional order, I think that will also impact on the trust that we have among each other, because the trust comes from the fact that we're all liberal democracies following the rule of law. And I see this as a potentially big problem, especially when it comes to the rule of law, because that directly affects the EU as a legal community and also Schengen. So I think that's another factor to keep in mind in these debates. But I'm happy for the optimism that's in this panel.
Thank you, Michal. Tom, your last remarks, final remarks.
Yeah, just to thank you all for this, for organizing this, for the paper. I think keep up that work. This is really indispensable and will feed into the work that we're doing. Yes, I am an optimist. I think we do need to indeed, as alluded to, build on our fundamental rights and values that unites us in Europe. Trust is something that takes a lot of time. It comes by foot, it leaves by horseback, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of hard work. And we're 35 years into Schengen, and it will need a little bit more of additional work. But you can trust on us to come forward with good proposals, and then we as always, we find political solutions to political problems in a spirit of compromise with the Parliament first and foremost, and of course with the member states. So,
thank you, Tom. Katarina.
Well, it's a final point maybe to pick up knowing the allure of borders and of control, to think more about how we reduce the domestic pressure for having the internal border controls and sustaining them, both vis-a-vis migrants, free movement, and crime and terrorism. I think what would really help us as a think tank doing and work on this would be to have more simple cost-benefit analysis of what is the price of keeping things as they are, as they were, as introducing a smart Schengen. I don't think member states individually are the best placed or are going to do these kind of cost-benefit analysis, but I think they would really help in knowing where would be the most smart places to introduce more control, and to where are criminals caught. It could be crime statistics, but maybe a coordinated attempt to do a Schengen-related cost-benefit analysis as a suggestion to Tom and the Commission. I think that would help think tanks work a lot.
Thank you, Katarina. Alena, your final remarks?
I will definitely join the ranks of optimists who are aware of all the complicated situation around us, but who are ready to work to make this optimistic scenario happen. And following the other suggestions of what else we need to discuss to move the agenda forward, one aspect that we didn't have time to discuss today, but I suggest another discussion on this matter, we do need to talk also about the global perspective. We focused on the internal EU issues, but even if we work very hard, it is very unlikely that the EU by itself is going to solve even the issue of the internal functioning of the Schengen zone. We do need to work with the global partners on deciding how we're gonna help people to have economic options at home, how we're going to manage migration flows, how we control the threat of terrorism globally, and of course, directly relating for the EU, how we regulate and how we create opportunities for legal movements in Europe for people who were not fortunate enough to be born in Europe.
Thank you very much to all of you for this insightful conversation. This is a start of it as we embark on a longer effort from the GLOBSEC side to help the Commission, Parliament, member states with research and analysis pertaining to borders, to Schengen, and how do we ensure that the four fundamental freedoms that the Union is built upon will continue to exist with or without global crisis and pandemics. I don't have a, usually there will be a round of applause from everyone, but in this current context, I think that we'll leave it with a thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to the audience, and looking forward to continuing engaging in the future. Goodbye. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.